I inherited 1,000 acres and found a whole neighborhood sitting on it. I'm at my grandfather's old cattle gate when a white BMW X7 skids to a stop like she owns the place. Out steps Constance Hartwell, HOA president, attorney, and professional menace. Designer sunglasses, clipboard death grip. She shoves violation notices at my chest. Tear down this gate, you're blocking our private road. Her road. The same road my grandfather carved in 1959, the same land her entire HOA was built on without a single legal right-of-way. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, just nodded and returned to my truck. Because tomorrow morning, the county survey arrives, and when she sees where her million-dollar homes actually sit, let's just say Willowbrook Estates is about to learn who really owns the ground under their feet. What would you do if an HOA tried claiming your family's land? Drop your state below. My name's Clayton Bridwell. I'm 52, and 8 months ago I inherited something I never expected would turn into a war zone. When my grandfather passed, he left me 1,000 acres of the prettiest ranch land in Cedar Valley, Texas. The old farmhouse still creaks the same way it did when I was a kid, and every morning I make coffee while looking out the kitchen window at rolling hills that have been in my family since 1962. I'm a semi-retired electrician, been living off Social Security and the occasional wiring job. My wife Sarah died of cancer last winter, and let me tell you, that woman always dreamed bigger than our bank account. She wanted to start a scholarship fund for local kids who couldn't afford college, but we never quite had the money to make it happen. The ranch sits on some of the most valuable land in the county now, worth about $2.3 million if I ever wanted to sell. But I live on $1,800 a month, and the property taxes keep climbing because of all the fancy development going up around me. The one thing that's never changed is the natural spring that feeds into Cedar Creek. My grandfather's well has been pulling pure, cold water from that spring since 1964. That's where Constance Hartwell enters the picture. She drives up in that pristine BMW wearing $300 heels that have no business in ranch dirt. Everything about her screams money and authority. The Chanel sunglasses she never takes off, the way she talks in legal jargon like she's trying to confuse you on purpose. That clipped voice that makes everything sound like a command. Constance is the president of Cedar Valley Estates, this luxury HOA community they built in 2018. We're talking 200 homes with an average price tag of $800,000. These people have more money than sense, and apparently they think that gives them the right to whatever they want. She steps out of that car and immediately starts talking down to me like I'm some kind of hillbilly. Your little farm is blocking our residents' access to Canyon Vista Country Club, she says, waving her manicured hand at my grandfather's gate. This road has been a public easement for years. Now, I may not be a fancy lawyer, but I know my family history. My grandfather built that road in 1962 with his own hands and a borrowed bulldozer. The cedar fence posts still smell like the day he set them, and I've got the leather work gloves he wore hanging in the barn. Every morning I can hear that old windmill turning lazily in the distance, same sound that's been marking time on this land for 60 years. But here's Constance standing in my dirt, telling me that somehow my private family road belongs to her community now. I carry this little leather notebook everywhere, habit I picked up from my grandfather. He documented everything, and I do the same. When I write, I always tap my pencil 3 times first. Sarah used to say I was too polite for my own good. But some fights are worth having. I still wear my wedding ring, and every morning I talk to Sarah's photo on the kitchen table. She'd have known exactly what to do about this situation. Me? I was confused as hell. My grandfather never mentioned anything about public easements or HOA rights. As far as I knew, that road was as private as the house itself. The stakes here aren't just about principle. I can't afford an extended legal battle on Social Security. But this land holds 4 generations of Bridwell sweat and sacrifice. My grandfather cleared every acre himself, my father worked this ranch until he was too old to walk the fence lines, and Sarah and I plan to pass it on someday. Constance wants $5,000 in attorney fees plus complete removal of my gate within 30 days. If I don't comply, she's threatening a $50,000 lawsuit that would cost me everything. That's when I realized this woman had picked the wrong fight. Within a week, Constance made good on her threat. A process server showed up at my door with official papers, a formal nuisance complaint filed with the county. The legal language was deliberately intimidating, full of phrases like unlawful obstruction of established public easement and willful interference with community infrastructure. My hands were shaking as I read those papers. $50,000 might as well be $50 million when you're living on Social Security. I couldn't even afford the $500 consultation fee most attorneys wanted just to look at my case. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with documents spread everywhere, feeling more overwhelmed than I'd been since Sarah's diagnosis. But sometimes when you can't afford to fight, you have to get smarter instead. I remembered my grandfather always said the courthouse holds all the answers if you know where to look. So I drove down to the county records office and paid $25 for a complete property search. The basement of that old courthouse smells like 50 years of musty papers and burnt coffee, but I spent the whole day down there with a copy machine and a lot of patience. That's when I found the first piece of the puzzle. My grandfather's original 1962 property deed included something specific: private road and water rights in perpetuity. I took photos of everything with my phone camera and made careful notes in my little notebook. The more I dug, the more interesting things got. See, here's something most people don't know about property law. Easements aren't automatically permanent. An easement is basically permission to cross someone else's land, but that permission has to be legally granted and properly recorded. Just because you've been using a road doesn't make it yours. Translation: walking across your neighbor's yard for years doesn't give you the right to build a driveway there. The records clerk was this older woman who'd been working there since the Carter administration. When I explained what I was looking for, she got real quiet and leaned in close. "That HOA road easement expired in December 2023, she whispered, like she was sharing state secrets. I felt my heart skip a beat. "What do you mean, expired?" She pulled out a folder that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. "Your grandfather signed a 25-year temporary access agreement back in 1998 when the first development started going in. But temporary means temporary. It expired last December and nobody renewed it." That's when I realized Constance Hartwell and her precious HOA had been trespassing on my land for 11 months. I sat in my truck outside that courthouse for a long time, just staring at the photocopies spread across my passenger seat. My grandfather's fountain pen signature was clear as day on the original deed, but there was no current legal agreement giving the HOA any rights to cross my property. The taste of victory was starting to mix with something else, the realization that this fight was bigger than I'd thought. I drove home taking the long way, past the HOA entrance where Constance's BMW was parked sideways across two spaces like she owned the place. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was lecturing me about property rights while her community had been illegally using my land for almost a year. That evening, I called the one attorney I could afford, the legal aid clinic that helped seniors with property disputes. The volunteer lawyer was a young woman named Maria Santos, and when I explained what I'd found, her voice got excited in a way that told me I was onto something. "Mr. Bridwell, if that easement really expired and was never renewed, then every day they've been using your road constitutes trespassing. In Texas, you can collect damages for unlawful use of private property." I started doing math in my head. 11 months of 200 families using my road to reach their country club. That added up to a lot of unauthorized trips across private land. But the best part was yet to come. Maria asked me to bring in every document I'd found, and that's when she spotted something that made both of us sit up straight. "Mr. Bridwell, has anyone from the HOA ever showed you their copy of a current easement agreement?" I realized that in all her legal threats and demands, Constance had never once produced any paperwork proving the HOA actually had the right to use my road. She'd been operating on pure intimidation, assuming I'd be too scared or too poor to fight back. That night, I made my first entry in what would become a very important notebook. Day 1. They're trespassing and they don't even know I know. Constance had no idea that her biggest mistake wasn't underestimating me. It was forgetting to do her homework. Constance's response to my legal research was swift and nasty. At 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, I woke up to the sound of bolt cutters snapping through wire mesh. The HOA maintenance crew was cutting my fence in 3 different places, right along the road where it crossed my property line. The crew leader, a guy who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation, handed me a work order. "HOA attorney says this is legal. We're just enforcing property rights, sir." I watched them take bolt cutters to 60 years of fence line while the smell of diesel exhaust from their truck mixed with the morning air. The sound of metal snapping was like fingernails on a chalkboard, and I could feel my blood pressure climbing with every cut. Within an hour, 12 of my cattle had wandered through the gaps and were causing a traffic jam on Highway 47. A sheriff's deputy showed up to inform me that my livestock were now a public safety hazard, and I needed to get them off the road immediately. "Sir, we've got complaints about cattle in people's front yards," Deputy Martinez explained, while I was trying to herd confused cows with a makeshift rope halter. The damage added up fast. $800 for fence repair, veterinary bills for one cow that got spooked and injured her leg on the pavement, and the pure humiliation of chasing livestock through a subdivision while HOA residents filmed it on their phones. But here's the thing about fighting people who think they can intimidate you. Sometimes they hand you exactly the evidence you need. I documented everything. Photos of the cut fence, timestamps on videos, measurements of the damaged sections. I filed a trespassing report at the sheriff's office and demanded that the HOA pay for damages. That's when Deputy Martinez pulled out a file folder that changed everything. "We've had 6 similar complaints about this HOA in the past year," he said, flipping through pages of incident reports. Property disputes, harassment, intimidation tactics. They've sued 3 other neighbors over boundary disputes they ended up losing. He showed me complaint after complaint. The Martinez family harassed over a drainage ditch, an elderly couple threatened over tree trimming, a veteran who'd been sued for parking his RV on his own property. The pattern was crystal clear. Cedar Valley Estates HOA used legal intimidation to bully anyone who stood in their way. "Document everything," Deputy Martinez advised. "They're building a pattern here, and judges don't like patterns of harassment." That afternoon, I drove to the hardware store and bought the materials to repair my fence. But I also picked up something else, a security camera system that could record in high definition and store footage in the cloud. Here's what most people don't understand about property boundary law. When a fence has been in the same location longer than the neighboring development, that fence line establishes the legal boundary. My grandfather's fence had been marking our property line since before most of these HOA folks were born. Translation: if your fence was there first, the burden of proof is on anyone who claims it's in the wrong place. I spent that evening installing cameras at 6 different points along my property line. The work felt good after a day of being pushed around, and the familiar smell of cedar fence posts reminded me why this fight mattered. My grandfather had built this place to last, and I wasn't about to let some entitled HOA president tear it down with legal tricks. The next morning brought another nasty surprise. Constance had left a voicemail that was equal parts threatening and condescending. "Mr. Bridwell, continued obstruction will result in escalated legal action. The community board has authorized me to pursue all available remedies." All available remedies. That sounded ominous. I started noticing the HOA maintenance truck driving by twice a day, always slowing down to take photos. Constance's BMW would park on the road just outside my gate, and I could see her sitting there with a clipboard, documenting something. But 2 could play that game. My new security cameras were capturing every drive-by, every trespassing incident, and every act of harassment. I'd learned something important from my grandfather's old surveying equipment, which I'd found in the barn. The secret to winning property disputes isn't just knowing where your boundaries are, it's proving when someone crosses them. That night, I called 3 different attorneys to get price quotes for representation. The cheapest was still more than I could afford, but something interesting happened during those conversations. 2 of the 3 lawyers had heard of Constance Hartwell, and neither had anything good to say about her tactics. "She's got a reputation for using legal costs as a weapon," one attorney told me. "Files expensive suits against people who can't afford to fight back." The irony was perfect. Constance's biggest strength, using the legal system to intimidate, was about to become her biggest weakness. Because I was finally starting to understand the game she was playing. Just when I thought Constance had run out of ways to make my life miserable, she found a new angle of attack. 2 weeks after the fence incident, I came home to find a county inspector standing next to my water well with a clipboard and a very serious expression. "Mr. Bridwell, I'm here about a complaint filed with the county water authority. Someone's claiming you're illegally drawing from the community aquifer and affecting the neighborhood water supply." The inspector handed me a shutdown notice. 48 hours to provide documentation proving my water rights, or face a $10,000 fine and permanent well sealing. My stomach dropped. Without that well, the ranch would be uninhabitable. Constance had brought her own expert, some hydrologist in a suit who was pointing at charts and talking about unauthorized groundwater extraction and community resource protection. The whole thing felt like an ambush designed to overwhelm me with technical jargon and time pressure. But here's the thing about growing up on a ranch. You learn that the best defense against fancy experts is simple, documented facts. I went straight to the barn where my grandfather had kept his records in an old filing cabinet that smelled like motor oil and leather. After 2 hours of digging through yellowed paperwork, I found what I was looking for: the original well permit from 1964, signed by the same county that was now threatening to shut me down. The permit was beautifully specific. My grandfather's well was drilled to tap a natural spring that had been flowing on our property since before Texas was a state. The documentation included geological surveys, water flow measurements, and even photos of the spring before any development existed in the valley. But the real treasure was a business card tucked behind the permit. Jim Richardson, county engineer, retired. I called the number, not really expecting it to work after all these years. Clayton Bridwell. I remember your grandfather well. Hell of a man, and he sure knew how to pick a water source. Jim Richardson had been the county engineer who'd approved my grandfather's original well installation. Even at 82 years old, his memory was sharp as a tack, and what he told me changed everything. Your grandfather's well taps the primary spring that feeds the whole valley, Jim explained. Those fancy HOA wells they drilled in 2018, they're actually drawing from the same underground flow that originates on your property. They're not losing water because of you. They're dependent on you. I felt like someone had just handed me the keys to the kingdom. Jim agreed to meet me at the ranch the next morning to document the spring source. We spent 3 hours measuring water flow, checking the original well equipment, and taking photos that proved the spring had been producing water continuously since 1964. Here's something most people don't know about water rights law in Texas. We follow the rule of prior appropriation, which means the first person to put water to beneficial use has permanent rights to that source. It doesn't matter what happens around you. First user wins. Translation: in water disputes, it's not about who has the biggest lawyer. It's about who was there first. The county inspector was fascinated by Jim's historical documentation. It turned out the HOA had never filed proper water rights claims when they developed the community. They'd just assumed they could drill wells and take whatever water they needed. This is highly irregular, the inspector admitted. The HOA should have conducted geological surveys before development to ensure adequate water supply. If they're drawing from Mr. Bridwell's spring source without easement rights, that's when I realized the full scope of what I was dealing with. The HOA wasn't just trespassing on my road, they were essentially stealing my water and then claiming I was stealing theirs. I started doing research at the public library, learning everything I could about water law and property rights. The legal aid attorney was thrilled with what I'd discovered. Clayton, this changes everything. If the HOA's water supply depends on your spring and they don't have legal access agreements, you've got leverage they never saw coming. The beautiful irony was that Constance's attempt to attack my water rights had revealed her own community's fundamental weakness. Cedar Valley Estates was paying $8,000 a month for supplemental water during dry seasons, trying to support 200 luxury homes with inadequate well capacity. My natural spring could supply the entire valley year-round and had been doing exactly that for decades. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset over land that had been in my family for 3 generations. The taste of that pure spring water was the same as when I was a kid, cold and clean and somehow tasting like home. For the first time since this whole fight started, I wasn't just playing defense. I was beginning to understand that I held all the cards. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning when I decided to go back to the courthouse and find the HOA's original easement filing. If Constance was so confident about her legal rights, surely there would be paperwork to back up her claims. The records clerk who'd helped me before looked puzzled when I asked for the Cedar Valley Estates easement documents. She searched for 20 minutes, checking different filing systems and cross-referencing property numbers. "That's strange," she finally said. "I'm not finding any easement recorded for your property. Let me check the developer's original filings." What she found instead made my blood run cold. There was an easement document on file dated 2017 and bearing my grandfather's signature. But my grandfather had died in 2015. I stared at that signature for a long time, feeling something between rage and disbelief building in my chest. Someone had forged my dead grandfather's signature to steal access to his land. The records clerk was as shocked as I was. "Sir, this is highly irregular. We'll need to flag this document immediately and notify the county attorney." I took photos of everything, the forged signature, the dates, the filing information. Then I drove straight to the legal aid office with hands that were shaking from pure anger. Maria Santos, the volunteer attorney, examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who'd seen fraud before. "Clayton, this isn't just trespassing anymore. This is felony document fraud, conspiracy, and theft of property rights. We need to compare this signature to authentic samples immediately." That afternoon, we spread out every document I'd found across a conference table. The differences were obvious once you knew what to look for. My grandfather had exclusively used a fountain pen since the 1970s. The forged signature was clearly made with a ballpoint pen. The handwriting was shaky and uncertain. Nothing like the firm, confident script I'd grown up seeing on birthday cards and Christmas letters. Most damning of all, my grandfather's medical records showed that severe arthritis had made it impossible for him to write legibly after 2014. The man whose signature appeared on a 2017 easement agreement hadn't been able to hold a pen for the last year of his life. "We need to find out who was behind this," Maria said. "Document fraud requires intent and opportunity, someone with access to property records and knowledge of your grandfather's death." The trail led back to Pinnacle Development Group, the company that had built Cedar Valley Estates, the same company that had filed the fraudulent easement documents, the same company that had gone bankrupt in 2020, leaving behind a trail of legal problems and unpaid debts. What I discovered next was the smoking gun that would change everything. Constance Hartwell hadn't just been the HOA president when this fraud occurred, she'd been Pinnacle Development's legal counsel. She had personally prepared and filed the documents that stole my family's land rights. She knew. She had always known that the HOA's claim to my property was built on forged papers and lies. I sat in my truck outside the legal aid office, holding proof that my grandfather's signature had been faked to steal his land. The taste in my mouth was like copper pennies, that metallic flavor you get when you're so angry you can barely think straight. But anger wasn't enough. I needed justice, and I needed it served in a way that would make sure this never happened to another family. That night, I called Sarah's sister and told her what I'd found. "They stole from him even after he died," I said. And hearing those words out loud made the whole situation real in a way it hadn't been before. This wasn't just about property rights or HOA disputes anymore. This was about people who thought they could forge a dead man's signature and get away with it. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The next 2 weeks were the most focused I'd been since Sarah's illness. Every morning I'd wake up with a clear mission: build an airtight case and set up the perfect trap for Constance's public downfall. My first stop was the hardware store, where I bought materials that would have seemed random to anyone else but made perfect sense to a retired electrician. Remote-controlled water shutoff valves, wireless monitoring equipment, and enough PVC fittings to control the entire water supply that flowed through my property. The beautiful thing about being an electrician is that you understand systems, how they work, where they're vulnerable, and how one switch can control everything downstream. Cedar Valley Estates got their water through 3 main lines that crossed my property, all feeding from the spring my grandfather had been protecting for 60 years. Installing those shutoff valves was like performing surgery. Each one was positioned where the HOA's water lines crossed onto my land, hidden but accessible. Completely legal since they were on my property. The wireless controls meant I could shut off their entire water supply from my smartphone. While I was doing the physical work, Maria Santos was building the legal case. She'd filed a quiet title action in county court, which is basically a legal process that forces everyone to prove their property claims in front of a judge. When you find fraudulent documents, the court can erase all the fake rights and restore the real ones. Here's what most people don't understand about property fraud. When someone forges documents, everything built on those fake papers becomes legally void. It's like a house of cards. Pull out the forged foundation, and the whole structure collapses. Translation: fake papers don't just get corrected, they get erased completely, along with everything that depended on them. The financial calculations were staggering. 7 years of unauthorized easement use, 200 families making roughly 3 trips per week across my private road, plus commercial water usage from my spring. Conservative estimates put the damages at $75,000, enough to fund Sarah's scholarship dream, and then some. But money wasn't the only goal here. I wanted accountability, and I wanted it public. My next stop was the county inspector's office, where I learned something interesting about the network of officials who'd been dealing with HOA complaints. Deputy Martinez introduced me to Jim Patterson, the water inspector, who turned out to be married to my cousin Jenny from Millerville. Small world, Jim laughed when he realized the connection. And speaking of small worlds, you should know that Constance Hartwell approached me last week with what amounted to a bribery attempt. That conversation led to another piece of evidence. Jim had been documenting HOA corruption for months, collecting reports of attempted bribes, intimidation tactics, and suspicious permit applications. My case was just the latest in a pattern of systematic abuse. The ally network was growing. Jim Richardson, the retired county engineer, agreed to testify about the spring's history. Deputy Martinez provided police reports showing the HOA's harassment pattern. The records clerk who'd discovered the forged signature was willing to serve as a witness. Most importantly, I'd been contacted by Rebecca Torres, an investigative reporter from the local TV station who'd been working on a story about development fraud in rural communities. My grandfather's forged signature was exactly the kind of evidence she needed to expose a larger pattern of corruption. The technical preparation was meticulous. I tested the water shutoff system repeatedly, making sure I could control it remotely without any delays. The security cameras were positioned to capture every angle of the upcoming confrontation. I even practiced the timing, how long it would take for the water pressure to drop throughout the HOA community once I activated the shutoffs. The legal strategy was equally precise. Maria had timed the process server to deliver our lawsuit right in the middle of what was supposed to be Constance's victory lap. The quiet title action would officially challenge every document the HOA had used to claim rights to my property. Rebecca Torres had coordinated her crew to arrive exactly when the water crisis would be at its peak. Nothing gets public attention like 200 families suddenly losing water during a community meeting. I spent hours at the kitchen table, organizing every piece of evidence into a presentation that would be impossible to dispute. Side-by-side photos of real versus forged signatures. Medical records proving my grandfather couldn't have signed anything in 2017. Water usage data showing the HOA's complete dependence on my spring. The timeline was perfect. HOA board meeting scheduled for Thursday at 7 p.m. Water shutoff planned for 7:30, right in the middle of Constance's presentation about my harassment. Media arrival at 8. Process server delivering our lawsuit at 8:15. The night before the meeting, I visited Sarah's grave and told her about the plan. Honey, we're going to help a lot of kids go to college, and we're going to make sure nobody else gets robbed the way Grandpa did. Everything was ready. Tomorrow, Constance Hartwell would learn what happens when you forge the signature of a Texas rancher. Constance's desperation became obvious when she started making moves that crossed the line from harassment into outright criminal behavior. Word travels fast in a small county, and she'd apparently gotten wind of my legal research through her network of political connections and real estate contacts. Her first attempt at damage control was breathtakingly stupid. Jim Patterson, the water inspector, called me on a Tuesday morning with news that made my coffee taste like victory. Clayton, you're not going to believe what just happened. Constance Hartwell showed up at my office yesterday afternoon with an envelope full of cash, trying to get me to red tag your well as contaminated. The details were almost comical. Constance had walked into a government office in broad daylight and offered Jim $2,000 cash to file a false report claiming my water was unsafe for consumption. When he refused, she'd tried a different approach, offering his wife an exclusive real estate opportunity at below-market rates. She actually said the words, "I can make this worth your while," Jim told me. I've been in this job for 15 years, and nobody's ever been dumb enough to try bribing me with witnesses around. Jim had done exactly what any honest public servant would do. He'd documented the attempted bribery and reported it to his supervisor. More importantly, he'd recorded the conversation on his phone, which meant we now had audio evidence of Constance trying to corrupt a county official. Here's something most people don't realize about public corruption. Attempting to bribe a government employee is a federal crime even if the bribery fails. It doesn't matter whether the official takes the money, just making the offer is enough to land you in serious legal trouble. Translation: trying to buy off a county inspector is like robbing a bank. The FBI takes it personally, whether you succeed or not. The beautiful irony was that Jim Patterson turned out to be married to my cousin Jenny, who'd been following this whole HOA dispute through family gossip. When Constance walked into his office trying to buy false testimony against me, she was essentially asking a family member to betray his own blood. She had no idea who she was talking to. Jenny laughed when I called to thank her. Jim came home madder than I've seen him since our property tax got reassessed wrong. But Constance wasn't done making bad decisions. Over the next week, my security cameras captured a pattern of escalating surveillance that bordered on stalking. The HOA maintenance truck was now driving past my ranch 4 times a day, always slowing down to take photos. Constance's BMW would park just outside my property line for hours at a time while she sat there with binoculars and a notepad. The final straw came when I found fresh tire tracks leading right up to my water well housing. Someone had been trespassing on my property in the middle of the night, apparently trying to access my well equipment. The security footage showed 2 figures in dark clothing using flashlights to examine the well controls around 2 a.m. I called Deputy Martinez immediately. They're escalating to potential sabotage now. This has gone way beyond legal harassment. Deputy Martinez reviewed the footage with the focused attention of someone who'd seen this pattern before. Clayton, I think it's time to involve federal investigators. Between the document fraud, the attempted bribery, and now possible conspiracy to damage infrastructure, we're looking at multiple felonies here. That afternoon, I got a call that changed the entire dynamic of our conflict. Rebecca Torres from Channel 7 News had been investigating Pinnacle Development Group as part of a larger story about rural property fraud. My case wasn't just a single incident. It was part of a systematic pattern of development companies using forged documents to steal land rights from rural families. We found evidence of similar fraud in 3 other counties, Rebecca told me. Always the same pattern. Developer claims easement rights on elderly landowners' property, files forged documents after the original owner dies, then uses legal intimidation to maintain the illegal access. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Pinnacle Development had apparently been forging easement agreements across Texas for years, targeting rural families who couldn't afford to fight back in court. My grandfather's signature was just one of dozens they'd faked to steal property rights. But here's where Constance had made her biggest mistake. By trying to bribe Jim Patterson and engaging in surveillance harassment, she'd escalated a property dispute into a federal investigation. The FBI takes public corruption seriously, especially when it involves systematic fraud against vulnerable populations. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sun set over land that had been stolen and was about to be returned. The smell of cedar and the sound of my windmill turning felt like promises being kept across generations. Constance Hartwell had spent months trying to intimidate me with legal threats and harassment tactics. Tomorrow night she was going to learn what real legal consequences looked like. Constance's final desperate gambit was a masterpiece of legal overreach that perfectly demonstrated why people hate HOAs. 3 weeks before our showdown, she called an emergency board meeting and convinced the other board members to authorize a $100,000 lawsuit against me for what she called malicious harassment and infrastructure damages. The legal papers were delivered by the most aggressive process server I'd ever encountered, a guy who looked like he'd been hired specifically to intimidate rather than just serve documents. He showed up at my door at 6 a.m, pounding loud enough to wake the dead, demanding that I sign for what he called serious legal consequences. The lawsuit itself was a work of fiction that would have been impressive if it weren't so transparently desperate. Constance claimed that my illegal obstruction of their road access was costing the community thousands of dollars in alternative transportation arrangements. She alleged that my water well was maliciously contaminating their supply. Most ridiculously, she argued that my legal research and document gathering constituted harassment and stalking of HOA board members. The $100,000 figure wasn't random. It was calculated to be exactly enough to force me into bankruptcy and foreclosure on the ranch. Constance had done her homework about my financial situation and was betting that I'd surrender rather than risk losing everything in a legal battle I couldn't afford. Her cease and desist letter was even more revealing. Written on expensive law firm letterhead, it demanded that I immediately cease all interference with community water supplies and desist from harassing community members with frivolous legal claims. The letter gave me 72 hours to withdraw all complaints and agree to remove my gate permanently. But Constance's biggest mistake was hiring Blackwood & Associates, a Dallas law firm with a reputation for expensive litigation and aggressive tactics. These weren't local attorneys who understood community relationships. They were hired guns who charged $400 an hour to intimidate people with threatening letters and cost-prohibitive legal procedures. The retainer alone for my defense would have been $25,000. Even if I'd won the case, the legal costs would have bankrupted me and forced the sale of the ranch. Except that Constance had no idea what was waiting for her. While she was spending HOA emergency funds on expensive attorneys, Rebecca Torres had been putting together the final pieces of her investigative report. The Channel 7 news team had obtained internal documents from Pinnacle Development showing a systematic pattern of easement fraud across 4 counties. My grandfather's forged signature was featured prominently as Exhibit A in what was about to become a major corruption scandal. Maria Santos had been equally busy preparing our counterattack. The quiet title action was ready to file, backed by ironclad evidence of document fraud and supported by sworn affidavits from 3 different experts. More importantly, she'd coordinated with federal investigators who were now treating this as part of a larger RICO case against organized real estate fraud. "Clayton, this isn't just about your ranch anymore," Maria explained. "The FBI is building a case against a network of developers, attorneys, and public officials who've been systematically defrauding rural landowners for years. Your evidence is the keystone that makes their whole case." The final escalation came when Constance made the mistake of threatening people beyond her legal reach. She'd apparently been calling county officials, demanding that they support her version of events and pressure me to settle. When that didn't work, she tried contacting my neighbors with offers to share information about my legal troubles if they'd support the HOA's position. Deputy Martinez showed me a recording of one such call, where Constance had essentially tried to organize a neighborhood conspiracy against me. "She's burning bridges faster than Sherman marched through Georgia," he observed with obvious satisfaction. The beautiful irony was that every desperate move Constance made was providing more evidence for our case. The expensive lawyers she'd hired were generating billable hours documenting their own client's systematic fraud. The threatening letters were proof of ongoing harassment. The attempted bribery and surveillance were federal crimes that would put her in prison regardless of how the property dispute played out. Rebecca Torres called me the night before the HOA meeting with news that made everything perfect. "Clayton, we're going live tomorrow night with the biggest rural fraud expose we've ever produced. Your story is the centerpiece, and we've got documentary evidence of at least 12 other families who've been victimized by the same pattern." That evening, I did something I hadn't done since Sarah died. I put on my grandfather's old Sunday suit, the one he'd worn to church every week for 30 years. It still smelled faintly of his cologne and the cedar wood from his workshop. Tomorrow night, Constance Hartwell was going to face justice served by the very legal system she'd been manipulating for years. The only question was whether she'd go down fighting or simply collapse under the weight of her own corruption. Thursday evening, 7 o'clock sharp, and the Cedar Valley Estates Community Center was packed like Christmas service at a small-town church. Word had gotten out about the emergency HOA meeting, and it seemed like half the county had shown up to watch the fireworks. I parked my old pickup truck between a Mercedes and a Lexus, feeling like David walking into Goliath's backyard. The community center buzzed with nervous energy, 150 HOA residents crowding into folding chairs, all wondering why their water bills had been so high, and why this property dispute had dragged on for months. Rebecca Torres and her news crew were setting up equipment in the back corner, professional and unobtrusive but impossible to miss. Deputy Martinez had positioned himself near the exit, officially there for community safety, but really waiting to see justice served. Constance stood at the front of the room in a power suit that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check, projecting confidence she definitely wasn't feeling. Her expensive lawyers flanked her like bodyguards, briefcases full of documents that were about to become worthless. I took a seat in the back row, carrying nothing but my grandfather's old surveyor briefcase and my smartphone with the water control app already loaded. The meeting started exactly as I'd expected. Constance launched into a presentation about protecting community resources from outside harassment, complete with charts and graphs designed to make me look like some kind of rural terrorist threatening their suburban paradise. "Mr. Bridwell's continued obstruction is costing our community thousands of dollars in legal fees and alternative water sources," she announced, clicking through slides that painted me as the villain in their property rights drama. "His harassment of board members and frivolous legal claims are disrupting the peace and security that makes Cedar Valley Estates the premier community in the region." The crowd was buying it, mostly because they didn't know the real story yet. Heads were nodding, people were whispering about property values and community security. Constance was building to her big finish, a demand that I drop all legal claims and submit to the HOA's authority. That's when I activated the trap. 7:30 p.m., right in the middle of her PowerPoint presentation, I opened the water control app on my phone and shut off all 3 main lines feeding Cedar Valley Estates. The effect was immediate and unmistakable, the sound of water pressure dropping throughout the building, followed by confused murmurs as people realized something was wrong. "What's happening to our water?" someone called out from the middle of the room. Constance's face went white as she realized what was occurring. "This is sabotage," she shouted, pointing in my general direction. "Someone call the police!" Deputy Martinez stepped forward with perfect timing. "Ma'am, I'm right here. Would you like to explain how Mr. Bridwell owns water flowing through his property on documents you know are fraudulent?" That's when I stood up, grandfather's briefcase in hand, and walked to the front of the room. The crowd parted like I was carrying something dangerous, which in a way I was. "Actually, Constance, it's my grandfather's spring water," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "Flowing through pipes installed without permission on forged documents that you personally filed." The portable projector Rebecca had set up showed my evidence on the same screen Constance had been using for her lies. Side by side, photographs of my grandfather's real signature versus the forgery from 2017, blown up large enough for everyone in the room to see the obvious differences. The crowd's reaction was immediate and audible. Gasps, angry murmurs, people pulling out their phones to take pictures of the evidence. These weren't stupid people. They could see with their own eyes that someone had faked a dead man's signature to steal his land. "That's impossible," Constance stammered, but her voice had lost all its authority. "There must be some mistake." "The only mistake," I replied, looking directly at her, "was thinking you could forge a Texas rancher's signature and get away with it. My grandfather died in 2015, yet somehow he signed your easement agreement in 2017. Either we're dealing with a zombie or someone's been committing felony fraud." Deputy Martinez stepped forward with what looked like federal agents in tow. "Ms. Hartwell, you're under investigation for conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted bribery of public officials, and violation of federal RICO statutes." The room exploded in shocked conversation. Rebecca's cameras captured everything. Constance's breakdown, the crowd's angry realization they'd been lied to, the federal agents presenting their credentials. But the best moment came when I offered to restore their water immediately upon agreement to negotiate a fair easement that honored both my property rights and their community needs. Within 2 hours, the water was flowing again. Constance had resigned in disgrace, and a new HOA board was asking how they could make this right. Sometimes justice tastes exactly like cold spring water after a long, hot fight. The aftermath moved faster than anyone expected. Within 48 hours, Cedar Valley Estates had a new board of directors who understood the difference between legal authority and criminal conspiracy. The emergency vote to remove Constance was unanimous, and her expensive Dallas lawyers disappeared faster than morning mist when the retainer checks stopped coming. The financial settlement took 3 weeks to negotiate, but the numbers were everything I'd hoped for. $75,000 for 7 years of unauthorized easement use, plus a formal ongoing agreement for $500 monthly for legitimate road and water access. The HOA's insurance company paid my legal costs without argument. Apparently, coverage doesn't extend to document fraud and attempted bribery. More importantly, we established binding protections that would prevent this kind of abuse in the future. The new easement contract was recorded properly with the county, included strict limits on water usage to protect the spring's sustainability, and required community approval for any major legal actions involving more than $5,000. Constance herself faced consequences that went far beyond losing her HOA presidency. The federal investigation resulted in conspiracy charges related to the broader Pinnacle Development fraud scheme. Last I heard, she was looking at 3 to 5 years in federal prison and complete disbarment from practicing law in Texas. But the real victory was what came next. 6 months after our confrontation, I stood in the same community center for the first annual Sarah Bridwell Memorial Scholarship Ceremony. $50,000 from the settlement had created an endowment that would help rural kids pursue trade education for decades to come. The scholarship recipients were exactly the kind of students Sarah had always wanted to help, kids with more determination than money, smart enough to succeed, but too poor to afford college without assistance. The ceremony was everything Sarah would have loved. 3 high school seniors received full-ride scholarships to the regional technical college with guaranteed apprenticeships in electrical work, welding, and mechanical engineering. The community center was packed again, but this time with families celebrating opportunity instead of fighting over property rights. I'd finally taken off my wedding ring that morning and placed it on Sarah's grave before the ceremony. Honey, we did it, I told her headstone. Kids are going to college because of our fight, just like you always dreamed. The personal healing that came with closure was unexpected but profound. For the first time since Sarah's death, I could imagine a future that included more than just survival. I'd started dating again after meeting Janet Morrison, a volunteer coordinator for the scholarship program who shared my interest in helping rural families navigate legal challenges. The ranch itself had been transformed from a burden into a legacy. Property values had stabilized once the legal disputes were resolved, but more importantly, I'd established the Rural Property Rights Workshop series. Every month, families from across the region gathered at the community center to learn about easement law, property boundaries, and how to protect themselves from development fraud. The free legal clinic that grew out of my case was helping dozens of families avoid the kind of harassment I'd endured. Maria Santos had expanded her practice specifically to handle rural property disputes, and we'd successfully defended 8 other families against similar HOA abuse tactics. The media attention had broader impacts than I'd imagined. Rebecca Torres's investigative series won a regional Emmy for corruption reporting, and the documentary film crew that followed our story was now producing a feature-length film about rural property rights that would air nationally next year. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the simplest one. The road that had caused so much conflict was now clearly marked with proper signage acknowledging both community access and private property rights. The water flowed clean and abundant, serving both my ranch and the HOA community under a fair agreement that respected everyone's legitimate needs. 6 months later, my phone rang with a familiar pattern. Another elderly neighbor facing pressure from a different development company over creek access rights. I was checking my grandfather's surveying equipment and reaching for my notebook when I answered. "Well," I told Sarah's photo on the kitchen table, "looks like we're not done fighting yet." Drop a comment below with your own HOA horror story. I bet you've got neighbors who need to hear this one. Hit that share button because someone in your feed is probably fighting City Hall right now. Subscribe for more David versus Goliath stories where the little guy wins with brains instead of lawyers. Next week, how a retired teacher shut down an entire school board with one simple records request.